What happens when a man carefully plans his wife's exit, only to discover he was never the one holding power? 7 months pregnant and still grieving her mother, Clara is offered a car condo, a monthly allowance, and a clean dismissal from the life she helped build. But behind his perfect script lies one fatal mistake. He thought she was powerless. He never imagined the woman he tried to discard was about to inherit a legacy far greater than his ambitions.
The holographic model of the Oracle AI spun silently in the center of their San Francisco penthouse, a monument to her husband's ambition. The last of the venture capitalists had just departed, leaving the scent of expensive bourbon hanging in the air. Across the room, Ethan's voice was as precise and polished as his product pitches, and just as devoid of warmth. "Clara, we need to sunset the legacy protocols." She was 7 months pregnant. Her father had been gone only 3 weeks, and the man she'd built a life with was talking about their future as if it were an outdated operating system. But this wasn't about an upgrade, it was about a complete wipe. The other woman, it was his head of strategy, Sasha, the sharp-witted executive who had complimented her maternity dress just an hour before. The woman who had raised a glass to their future, her intense eyes glinting as she toasted to disruptive new partnerships. That same woman had been strategizing more than just product launches with Ethan for the last 18 months. They had orchestrated this entire evening, waiting until after her father's funeral to finally deploy their plan. He called her too traditional, said her interests weren't scalable, and offered her a fully managed luxury condo in the marina and $25,000 a month, a rounding error for a man whose company had just been valued at $10 billion. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that her father, Marcus, the quiet, unassuming computer science professor who lived in a small bungalow in Berkeley and always smelled of coffee and old textbooks, had been a silent, early-stage investor in tech companies that were now global giants. And he had left every last share of his stock portfolio to his pregnant daughter. This is the story of a woman who was told her life is being decommissioned, only to discover she was about to own a controlling interest in the entire valley. She lost a husband and a rival she once respected, but found that she'd been the architect of her own fortune all along. Yet the true inheritance wasn't the stock portfolio, it was a quiet, analytical strength forged in late-night coding sessions, something no market crash could ever erase. Stay with me, because this story is a reminder of a truth every woman needs to hear. Your worth was never defined by the man who wrote you into his business plan. It was never contained within the smart glass walls of a home he built, or the last name he gave you. Sometimes, the people you co-found your world with will be the ones who initiate the hostile takeover. Sometimes the very framework you trusted is the one that gets corrupted. But their system reboot is not your story. Your full-scale launch is. Marcus raised his daughter on a shoestring budget on purpose because he knew that a woman who learns to find the elegance in the source code will never be overshadowed by a flashy user interface. This story is for every woman who has ever been called too sensitive, who has been made to feel like a beta test, who has ever had to kneel and pick up the broken pieces of her own life from the floor, and wonder how to recompile them. You were never just a feature, you just hadn't accessed your own admin panel. If this story resonates with your own internal logic, if you feel that systematic injustice and that spark of a creative comeback, then you have found your community. This channel is for women who find power in rebuilding, women who engineer their own empires, women who remember the master password to their own lives. If you're not already part of our network, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss a system update. Tell me in the comments, when did you discover a hidden strength in your own programming you never knew was there? I read every one of your stories and they provide the data for the ones we tell next. Hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their own incalculable value today. And if you're ready for another story of a comeback, check out the link I've posted for you on the screen. Now, let's begin. The last bourbon glass had been cleared away, and the glowing hologram of the oracle was the only guest remaining in their living room. Behind her, Ethan's voice was calm, which was always more alarming than his frustration. "Clara, we need to finalize the asset migration." The words belonged in a quarterly report, not in their home, not tonight. She stood in the middle of their Pacific Heights penthouse, barefoot, 7 months pregnant, her silk dress feeling like a uniform. The artisanal cheese board she'd spent the afternoon arranging, with items from a small farm in Sonoma, was untouched on the quartz island. Her father, Marcus, had taught her that appreciating elegant code was an act of focus, a way to admire brilliance without needing to own it. But she had been performing for a single user, and he hadn't even been logged in. It had been 21 days. That was it. 21 days since she'd stood on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, watching them scatter her father's ashes, while Ethan paced by the car, closing a funding round on a call he deemed mission critical. She had dismissed it as his lack of emotional bandwidth. Some people, she'd told herself, just don't have the programming for grief. She turned to face him now. Ethan was a sharp silhouette against the glittering grid of the San Francisco skyline. His designer suit was immaculate, his posture unyielding. He hadn't reached a conclusion. He had executed a pre-written script. On the counter beside him, her smart tablet lit up. He had shared a file, a single cold document titled partnership_dissolution_v2.docs. "It's the most logical path forward, Clara," he said, his voice flat. She glanced at the tablet, then at the untouched cheeses, then at the man she had been married to for 5 years, the man who had proposed to her on the day his first startup went public. She'd mistaken it for a grand romantic gesture, a public commitment. A man so confident in their merger that he wanted the whole world to witness it. Now she saw the truth. It wasn't a commitment, it was a press release. He had acquired her. Why? The word was a whisper, a glitch in the vast, silent programming of the penthouse. She hated the vulnerability in her own voice, the way it turned a question into an error message. Ethan adjusted the strap of his smartwatch, a precise, controlled motion. The same motion he used before walking on stage at a tech conference. "Our long-term objectives are no longer aligned, Clara. My brand requires a partner who can interface with the board, someone with a more impactful public profile. I am your wife. I am carrying your child, and you will both be fully supported. I've secured a penthouse for you in the marina. It's fully automated, 3 bedrooms. You won't have to handle any of the setup." A penthouse. He had already secured it. This wasn't a conversation, it was a deployment. And in that moment, the entire system crashed. All the small data points her heart had logged and ignored came rushing back. The faint, sharp scent of a spicy perfume on his jacket last week, not her soft vanilla scent, but Sasha's signature fragrance. His laptop, which was now protected by a new biometric lock. The private channel on their home AI assistant that he claimed was just for testing new voice commands. "Is it Sasha?" she asked, and the answer was already cached in her soul. Ethan's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the spinning oracle hologram. "This is about a strategic pivot," he said, but his whole demeanor was a fatal error. She knew that tell. She'd seen him use it with investors for years. When a product was failing, he'd focus on the prototype instead of their faces. When the data was bad, he stared at the projections. She walked toward the island, not to argue, not to debug. She picked up the small, minimalist knife meant for the aged Gouda. She held it, the cool metal a solid, grounding object in her hand. She wasn't thinking of hurting him. She was thinking of how cleanly you could sever a connection. She stared at her reflection in the dark, polished blade, a distorted, pregnant woman she didn't recognize. The baby kicked, a hard, definite assertion, a reminder that she was a multi-threaded process. Ethan watched her for a second, a flicker of something, not worry, but liability assessment, in his eyes. He straightened his jacket. "The logistics team is scheduled for 8 a.m., he said, "to migrate your personal data." He turned and left. The seamless door slid shut with a quiet, pneumatic whoosh. Clara was alone in a smart house that had never felt like a home. She set the knife down and leaned against the cold quartz, her belly pressing into the edge. On her tablet, the document detailing her new provisioned life glowed. She could smell the leftover fig jam, the sharp scent of olives, and the faint, spicy perfume that Sasha had left behind her. Her father's scent had been coffee and dust and safety. Her smartwatch buzzed on her wrist. A message. It was from Sasha, her rival, her peer, the woman who had placed a hand on her arm at the funeral, the woman who had given her advice on which charity was best for donating her father's old computer equipment, the woman who had been in this very room an hour ago and toasted to her future. The message read, "Deployment complete. Let me know if you run into any permission issues. S." It wasn't an offer of help. It was a project sign-off, a status update. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. It was the brutal efficiency of it, the assumption that she was just another asset to be migrated. The message hadn't arrived 10 minutes after Ethan left. It had been sent before his footsteps had even faded down the hallway. They were working from the same script. She didn't reply. She couldn't. She put her watch on the counter, face down. She laid a protective hand over her stomach where their sun was turning, oblivious to the storm gathering outside her womb. "This is our story now, little one," she thought, her whisper lost in the silent, glass-walled penthouse overlooking Puget Sound. She didn't fully comprehend it yet, but the forgotten tablet wasn't just a careless mistake. The real poison, the digital key that would shatter her existence, was glowing on the marble kitchen island. The dawn broke, a wash of pale, watery light over the gray Seattle skyline. Maya hadn't slept at all. Just as the first light hit the Space Needle, she slipped out of their bed and walked into the nursery she had poured her heart into. The walls were painted a deep forest green, and she had spent the last month creating a sprawling mural of the Cascade Mountains, with tiny constellations twinkling above the peaks Leo, her husband, claimed to love. The crib, a beautiful piece of reclaimed cedar, was one she'd assembled alone after Leo swore his executive assistant would take care of it, and then it never happened. She sank into the rocking chair her father had bought them, a treasured piece from his own home in Queen Anne. It smelled of wood polish and promise, a safe scent. She began to rock, the voices echoing in her head, not Leo's, but the ones she had discovered an hour before when, with a sickening lurch in her gut, she had opened a pitch deck on his tablet and found the hidden presenter notes. Leo and Nina, her own cousin, their words clinical and intimate. "The timeline is solid. She'll be settled and out of the way before the Series A funding closes." He had leveraged her pregnancy to woo a venture capital firm known for backing family-first founders. She had seen the pictures from the investor dinner, a man polishing his brand, a man showing off his most recent, most heartfelt acquisition. Maya grabbed her phone, her finger hovering over her sister's contact. "Zara," she pressed call. It went straight to voicemail. "You've reached Dr. Zara Hassan. I'm either in surgery or on a mountain. Leave a message and I'll call you back when I'm not saving a life or my sanity." Her sister's voice, so full of direction. Maya hung up and called again, just to borrow a piece of that certainty. "You've reached Dr. Zara Hassan." Maya balanced the tablet on her expanding belly, feeling a faint flutter from the baby inside as she shut her eyes. By 2 a.m, a decision had cemented itself in her mind. It wasn't some fiery theatrical plot for revenge. It was the cold, quiet resolve a woman finds when her entire world has been torched, and she needs to sift through the ashes for a reason. Leo's tablet was right there on the coffee table, screen still unlocked. It was a stunning lapse in caution, unless he was so utterly convinced of her gentleness that he couldn't imagine she'd ever look. That was his perception of her, wasn't it? A beautiful, free-spirited artist who completed his image as a tech visionary, a view he'd held since they first met. Their whole relationship was built on that one assumption, his unwavering belief that she was too dreamy, too naive, too absorbed in her photographic world to ever challenge the narrative he so carefully crafted. She hadn't needed a password. He never bothered logging out. She'd been looking for a delivery confirmation for a baby gift when a file name hooked her attention. Nightingale. Brand narrative. A sterile corporate name, yet a sudden icy premonition made her tap it open. Her world splintered. It wasn't a marketing plan. The presentation was a collaboration with Nina. Not Nina, her cousin, her confidant. Just Nina, whose profile picture was stamped at the top with an editor credit, a mark of professional partnership that felt disturbingly permanent. Maya started to scroll through the version history, tracing the comments back to the document's creation. Her fingers felt like they belonged to someone else, but her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The file was created 18 months ago. This wasn't a recent slip-up, not a fleeting indiscretion. 18 months. It started before their wedding at the Olympic Sculpture Park, before she saw the positive pregnancy test, before she had turned down the foreign correspondent assignment, before any of this felt real. There were notes in the margins. My anchor, N. There were allusions to shared getaways, a sleek hotel in Austin for a tech conference, a weekend on Orcas Island he'd said was a solo trip to decompress. And there were the comments. Nina writing about watching the sunrise from the balcony of his new downtown high-rise, the same one where he had proposed to Maya beneath a sky of city lights. She scrolled on, and the conspiracy grew bolder. A comment from Nina, posted on the anniversary of Maya's mother's death. A day Maya had spent looking through old photos, weeping in Leo's arms while Nina sat on her other side, a rock of support. How much longer do we have to play these parts? Nina had typed. Leo had replied in the notes within the hour. Patience, my love. We just need to execute the community property waiver first. Community property waiver. As if Maya was a line item in a balance sheet, as if her grief was just another project milestone he had to clear before launching his new life. She hadn't been imagining it. She had registered the growing chasm between them, the late-night coding sessions that bled into the early morning, the blankness in his expression when she spoke about their son, the way his body seemed to curve away from hers in their bed, the uncanny way Nina always seemed to know his moods and his business updates before he shared them with her. She had sensed it in that quiet, animal part of her being where truth lives without words. She knew. She scrolled past the financial projections and the thinly veiled terms of endearment, past the digital blueprint of their deception. And then she came to the slide about their son. Leo's words in a clean, modern font beneath a heading that read 5-year personal roadmap. The child secures the founder narrative, but creates a more complex exit. The public-facing transition has to be flawless. Nina's reply was a single devastating word. Flawless! An approval. For her cousin, for the baby she claimed she couldn't wait to be an aunt to, the word was flawless. Maya's hands began to shake, the tablet vibrating in her lap. She hugged it to her chest, and the baby gave a sudden, powerful kick against the cool glass, as if he could feel the coming battle, as if he was already taking her side. She swiped the file closed, then opened it again, closed it, opened it. She begged the screen to reconfigure itself into a story she could withstand. A narrative where her husband cherished her, a reality where her cousin was loyal, a world where flawless was about a baby's future and not a betrayal. But the pixels were fixed and unforgiving. They always are. She found Nina's number. Not to start a war, she wasn't ready for that. She called because she needed to hear her voice, to hold its sound up against the cold, calculated words on the screen and try to understand how one person could contain both. She needed to chart the vast emptiness between someone who could pretend to be so full of love and someone so utterly devoid of it. "Maya, hi!" Nina's voice was effervescent and warm, like a sunny afternoon. "You're psychic! I just saw the most adorable little rain slicker and boots for the baby. We have to go get them this weekend. It's on me. How are you feeling?" Each word was a carefully polished lie. The effortless warmth, the familiar affection, it was a virtuoso performance from a woman who had been sleeping with her husband for a year and a half, while helping her plan her baby shower. Maybe, Maya heard herself say, the same hollow word she'd offered Leo earlier when he asked if she was happy with the nursery. This time, however, the word tasted like ash, like the final, heavy clang of a steel door closing forever. She ended the call, stumbled into the enormous stone-tiled bathroom, gripped the cold edges of the sink, and was violently ill. This wasn't the morning sickness of early pregnancy. This was something else entirely. This was her body physically expelling a truth so venomous it refused to be held inside. It was a sickness of the soul. She splashed icy water on her face, staring at the stranger in the mirror. 32 years old, 7 months pregnant. Her eyes were wide, dark craters of shock, and the silk robe, a first anniversary gift from Leo, felt like a costume from a play. She didn't look like a woman whose world had just been obliterated. She simply looked exhausted, as if she had been tired deep in her bones for a very, very long time and was only now realizing the cause. The most vicious part wasn't the affair. It wasn't the secret trips or the shared pitch deck. The deepest cut of all was about her baby, her son, the little person she was carefully building inside her own body, a person she already loved with a ferocity that burned brighter than anything else. Flawless. That was the word they'd used for a plan that had her erasure as its goal. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, feeling the strong, deliberate movement of a life that was hers and hers alone. "I am so incredibly sorry," she whispered to her son. "I'm so sorry this is the life I picked for you." Then she straightened her shoulders. She dried her hands on a thick towel embroidered with the sharp, graphic logo of Leo's company. She had a job to do. That tablet was a crime scene, and she was a photojournalist again. She bypassed the folders of user interface designs and the notes for his next keynote address. She spent the next hour navigating the digital scaffolding of her husband's life. And there, in the quiet, gray light before the city came alive, she found it. A folder in his cloud drive labeled personal_admin. Inside was a file named marital docs. It contained a scanned copy of an email exchange between Leo and Nina, her title listed as his personal counsel. The conversation started a week after their wedding. Nina had written, "Leo, I'm flagging this again. The post-nuptial agreement remains unsigned. You are exposed. This needs to be addressed now. As it is, the agreement is worthless." Liam's response was dripping with condescension. "I'm on it." A follow-up message from his lawyer, sent 3 months later. "Liam, this is a significant exposure. The prenuptial agreement is unenforceable. If this isn't rectified, Eliza would be owed 50% of your company equity under Massachusetts law." Liam's final reply: "She's a romantic. She won't make a fuss. Let it go." She's a romantic. She won't make a fuss. Eliza read that line 5 times. The first time, it stung. The second, it brought a sickening wave of realization. The third time, it became a vow. The third betrayal was a quiet, creeping poison, seeping into veins she hadn't known were there, solidifying her very marrow into something unbreakable. Without a valid prenup, she had a claim to half his biotech firm, half his stock options, half of every sterile, gleaming laboratory he had ever founded. His own attorney had flagged the risk twice, but Liam, blinded by his own brilliance, had dismissed it, certain she was too gentle to ever challenge him. His spectacular ego had always been his Achilles heel, and she was finally realizing that a man's biggest weakness is a woman's greatest opportunity. But there was another, more frigid betrayal beneath the surface. This one was between Liam and his mother, Genevieve. Genevieve, who always called her Eliza, but with an intonation that made it sound like a temporary placeholder. Genevieve, who for their first anniversary gifted her a first edition anatomy textbook from the 19th century inscribed to Liam for the future of medicine he is building. Eliza's name was conspicuously absent. Genevieve, who looked at Eliza as if she were a charming but ultimately disposable piece of starter equipment. Chloe's family has invaluable ties to the FDA Regulatory Committee, Genevieve had written in a message Eliza found saved in his phone. That is the relationship we need to secure. Finalize your current situation with minimal disruption. Liam's reply, I'm handling it. She'll get the Beacon Hill brownstone and be grateful for the soft exit. Grateful, as if their life together, their vows, their unborn son, were merely a phase 1 trial to be concluded. As if she should thank him for the courtesy of being so cleanly erased. Eliza closed the laptop, the screen fading to black with a soft click. Eliza walked into the half-assembled nursery and eased herself into the glider. A digital frame on the bookshelf was cycling through a slideshow of their history. She tapped the screen, pausing on a photo of herself and Sophie at a cafe in the North End, long before life had become so layered with secrets. They were clinking espresso cups, their faces bright with laughter. That afternoon, they'd made a pact to be front row at each other's greatest triumphs, Sophie's first $1 million funding round and Eliza's first major museum commission. It was a promise between two ambitious young women who hadn't yet learned the brutal calculus of compromise. She swiped. The proposal? It had been all over the Boston Society pages. Liam, down on one knee before a crowd of 1,000 people, just after accepting the Innovator of the Year award at a biotech gala. She wore a simple navy dress. He was in a tuxedo. She had thought it was the most breathtakingly romantic act. He was just so caught up in the victory, she'd explained to her friends. He told me he looked across the ballroom, saw me, and realized he didn't want to waste another minute. She had beamed with pride every time she told that story. There was no glow now. Now she saw the strategically positioned photographers, the journalists who had been conveniently pre-briefed, the timing that perfectly overshadowed a rival company's recent breakthrough. It wasn't a proposal, it was a brilliantly orchestrated piece of public relations. Another swipe. Her mother at the wedding. Helen, in a modest but lovely dress she'd found at a consignment shop, standing by the cake with a polite, quiet smile. But her eyes. Eliza could see it now in the crystal clear photo, a tiny detail she'd missed in the whirlwind of the day. Her mother's eyes were filled with a profound, knowing sadness. Helen's words from that day came back to her, whispered when they were alone for a moment. It was the new smart speaker that undid everything, a gift from Liam meant to simplify their lives. While Eliza was setting it up, it announced it was syncing devices on their shared family account. Suddenly, her phone buzzed with an alert. Liam's messages were now mirrored on her device. His private chats were filled with things she didn't recognize, endless meetings coded as Phase 3. Driven by a cold curiosity, she opened the thread. Buried between lab data and market projections was a conversation with Chloe she'd never seen, titled The Island. It wasn't about a corporate retreat. It was about a life. A magnificent, sprawling compound on Nantucket, complete with architectural drawings and a shared album of photos showing Liam and Chloe on an empty plot of land. His arm was draped possessively around her shoulders. Her head was tilted back in laughter. A sub-album contained scanned notes in Chloe's elegant cursive. "Our spot for morning coffee," read one caption under a photo of a windswept bluff. "A lab for you, a studio for me. Our real beginning. Our real beginning." Eliza took a step back, the words sucking the air out of the grand, historic brownstone Liam had bought. She suddenly felt trapped, smothered by the antique wood and polished silver. She went to the bay window, where the lights of the Boston skyline glittered over the Charles River. She looked at the city he was conquering, a million anonymous lives that suddenly felt more authentic than hers. She rested a hand on her pregnant belly as the baby kicked. This perfect life, this genius husband, this meticulously planned future. It was all just the groundwork for another woman's home. She didn't rage, she didn't weep. An icy, systematic calm washed over her. It's just us now, little guy, she thought. You and me. For the next hour, she moved with quiet purpose, packing an overnight bag, not with the fire of betrayal, but with the sharp clarity of a strategist. As she drew the zipper closed, the doorbell rang. A courier stood on the rain-slicked granite steps of their front stoop. He offered her a thick, cream-colored envelope from a law firm she'd never encountered, Finch and Prescott. She signed the digital scanner and shut the heavy door, the paper feeling dense and foreign in her hand. Prescott. It was her mother's maiden name, a name Helen had always dismissed as far too stuffy for a public librarian, a name that had no connection to the stories she'd told of a simple upbringing in Southie, a life of local libraries and secondhand books. The letter within was dense with legal jargon, summoning her for a meeting to discuss the final disbursement of her mother's estate. It contained phrases that felt alien, significant equity positions, trustee appointments, legacy trusts, and fiduciary duties. She almost dismissed it as a bizarre administrative error, something that couldn't possibly relate to her mother's quiet world of card catalogs and community reading programs. But the name held her, Prescott. It had a certain resonance, a whisper of a history she'd never been told. She placed the envelope on the marble kitchen counter, right beside her phone, which was displaying a search for Boston's most ruthless divorce attorneys. Two paths, one led away from the man who was building a new world without her, and the other led into the life of a mother who, it appeared, had kept her own world hidden from her. She had to decide between protecting her heart and securing her son's future. In that moment, neither felt possible. She stood in the kitchen, a single figure against the sparkling backdrop of the city, staring at the two choices. The life she had built was a fabrication, and the life her mother had lived was a riddle. But that was an issue for the morning. Tonight, she was just a woman, 8 months pregnant, standing in the rubble of her marriage, fighting for her next breath. The following day, her hand shook as she dialed the number on the firm's elegant stationery. She prepared herself for a clipped receptionist or an endless phone tree. Instead, a man with a calm, steady voice answered on the second ring, the kind of voice that implied patience was a virtue he had long ago mastered. "Alistair Finch," he said. "This is Eliza," she managed, her own voice thin and fragile. "I'm calling about a letter. Regarding my mother, Helen." There was a short, considerate silence. "Ah, Eliza. Yes, I was hoping I would hear from you. Your mother spoke of you in every single meeting we ever had." The pride in her voice was a force of nature. "You knew my mother?" "For nearly 40 years, he said gently. "She was an extraordinary woman. If I may be so bold as to ask, Eliza, did Helen ever tell you anything about the Prescott family?" Eliza sank onto a kitchen stool, the cold brass a minor jolt. The view of the Prudential Tower seemed to mock her. "No," she said, a short, brittle laugh escaping her lips. "My mother was a librarian. She lived in a rented duplex in Jamaica Plain. She drove a 20-year-old Volvo, and her biggest indulgence was buying first editions for the library's collection. He never once spoke of anyone named Thorne." Alistair Finch let the silence hang in the air of his Boston law office. When he resumed, his voice was quiet but carried the force to shatter Amelia's entire reality. Your mentor was Marcus Thorne, the only son of Edward Thorne, the founder of the Thorne Gastronomy Group, one of the great culinary dynasties of New England. At 22, he walked away from it all, changed his name, and built his reputation from scratch. But he made sure your birthright was protected. Amelia clung to the armrest of the leather chair, feeling the room swim. The baby kicked inside her, a sharp, definite reality as everything else turned to smoke. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Your mentor," Alistair explained, vested his controlling interest in the Thorne Group into an incredibly sophisticated trust. He spent 30 years quietly compounding that wealth, investing in sustainable agriculture and food tech startups, all managed by this firm. He also anonymously created a foundation that provides culinary school scholarships to kids from low-income neighborhoods. He valued his privacy above all else. How much? The question sounded weak and absurd, like asking for the recipe during a kitchen fire. "The current estimated value of the estate," Alistair said, his voice perfectly even, "is approximately $3.8 billion. The number was just noise. It had no meaning. 3.8 billion, 7 unpublished black books. The man who taught her how to find the history in a dish. The man who paid for her first research trip to Lyon out of his own modest salary. The man who glowed with pride when Amelia landed her first column, saying, 'You see, my girl, your own palate is more reliable than any borrowed opinion.' 7 unpublished books from the most revered, enigmatic food critic in the country. The first emotion that cut through her shock wasn't gratitude. It was a white-hot spear of betrayal. 'He never told me,' she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. 'My whole life I've been piecing together culinary histories. I worked my way through graduate school as a line cook. I ate instant ramen so I could afford rare cookbooks. He watched me struggle, and he never said a thing.' 'He needed you to build your own name first,' Mr. Finch said softly. He had seen what the Thorne name did to people. His own legacy felt like a gilded cage. Marcus wanted you to have a critical authority that no one could ever say was bought for you. He was planning to tell you, Amelia, after the baby was born. He left a letter. It explains everything. It's with his private effects. I can have a copy sent to your phone right now." "Yes, please," Amelia managed to say. The file appeared in her email a moment later. Amelia walked into the nursery, the room she and Julian had painted a soft sage green just last month. The unassembled Scandinavian high chair and the designer mobile of dangling silver spoons looked like props from another woman's life. She collapsed onto the floor, her back against the wall, and opened the file. Her mentor's familiar, elegant handwriting filled the screen. "My dearest Amelia," it started, "if you're reading this, then my final reservation has been honored. I am so sorry I could never find the right course to serve you the truth. I ran from the weight of the Thorne legacy because, in my world, a name becomes a brand. It makes people value the label over the ingredients. I needed you to grow up free from that shadow, to trust the integrity of your own taste. But this archive, these books, they are your inheritance. Use them to be secure. Use them to be heard. And if anyone ever tries to tell you what to think, you remember you come from a line of tastemakers as fundamental as the sourdough that built this city's bakeries. For my sharpest palate, Marcus." Amelia traced his name on the screen. She read the letter again, and then a third time, before the composure she had been desperately holding finally cracked. It wasn't gentle weeping. It was a raw, primal sob that ripped from her core, a sound of devastating loss and overwhelming love. She cried for the mentor she knew, the fiercely private genius, and for the giant whose full contribution to gastronomy the world would now discover. She cried for the man she thought she was building a life with, and the future that had just been burned to the ground. She wept for the man who believed in her so much he let her find her own strength, who forced her to become resilient. A man who preferred the quiet alchemy of a test kitchen to the blinding flash of restaurant openings and, in doing so, gave his protege the one thing a powerful connection never could, a truly independent point of view. She closed the file, holding the phone against her chest, and began to rock back and forth on the nursery floor, an ancient animal motion of self-soothing. She rocked until the sobs faded, and the silence in the apartment felt less like an emptiness and more like a cleansed palate. My mentor wasn't hiding his life's work from me, she realized with piercing clarity. He was preparing me for it. The baby kicked, a strong, assertive nudge from within. Amelia let out a watery, trembling laugh that held more defiance than grief. She laid both hands over her stomach. Your grandfather Marcus, she whispered, was the most brilliant, principled man I have ever known. And he just handed us the master recipes for this entire city. She stayed there for what felt like hours, rocking, breathing, feeling the immense weight of a lifetime of secret work settle upon her, not as a crushing burden, but as a chef's coat of authority. The weight of that legacy settled on her shoulders like a mantle she was finally strong enough to wear. Then she picked up her phone and dialed Mr. Finch. Mr. Finch, she said, her voice steady, I need you to ensure the full nature of this inheritance remains completely confidential. No public statements, no announcements, and absolutely no contact with my husband or his restaurant group. Of course. May I ask for the reason? Because I want to see how people behave when they think I have nothing left on my plate. There was a brief pause, then Finch let out a low, appreciative chuckle. It was the sound of a man recognizing Marcus Thorne's chosen heir. Your mentor, he said, would be exceptionally proud. Julian called on Thursday morning, his voice brisk and commanding, the tone he used with his suppliers and junior chefs. I need you to clear your things out of the study by tomorrow, he said. I have a consultant coming over to help me finalize the menu for Ember. A consultant. He lacked even the basic decency to say her name, to offer the thinnest shred of respect. A consultant. I've set up a transfer of $5,000 for your monthly expenses, he went on. It's more than generous, all things considered. My business manager will handle everything else. $5,000 a month from a man whose new restaurant had a budget in the tens of millions. The staggering arrogance of the offer was a masterpiece of its own kind. It felt like a world-famous chef tossing a box of instant noodles at a food historian and expecting a thank you. Fine, Amelia said, her voice a calm, hollowed-out space. I'll be gone by Friday. Good. I'm glad we can be professionals about this. Professionals, as if culinary theft and emotional betrayal were just items on a prep list. As if kicking his pregnant wife out of their home 5 weeks after her mentor died was just a simple inventory change. She hung up the phone and stood in their Boston brownstone, surveying the curated life he had plated, the high-end German appliances he chose, the rare culinary books he pretended to have read, the view of the city it had never truly felt like her own. Let him see me as fragile, she thought. Let him think I'm content with the scraps he offers from his grand vision. He has no idea I'm holding the source code that makes his entire investment strategy look brilliant. But she wouldn't just crash the system. That wasn't what Henry the luthier had taught her. He didn't teach her to smash a flawed instrument out of anger. He taught her that sometimes you have to let the dissonant notes hang in the air until the faulty craftsmanship reveals itself. Friday arrived. Eliza walked into their Soma penthouse at 10 in the morning with her work tablet and zero illusions. What she discovered was more brazenly staged than she could have ever conceived. Serena was there in Eliza's home studio, wearing one of Marcus's expensive merino wool hoodies. She was sipping a cortado from Eliza's favorite mug, the one with the asymmetrical handle from a small ceramicist in Sausalito, a gift from Henry. And she was scrolling through Eliza's user experience frameworks on the massive smart display, the one calibrated with the precise color spectrum for her research. The sheer nerve was breathtaking. It wasn't just the affair, but the casual colonization of her creative territory, the way Serena occupied Eliza's studio, swiping through Eliza's data as if she had already been named the firm's new head of product innovation. "Eliza," Serena began, placing the mug down. She walked toward her, hands raised in a gesture of well-rehearsed sincerity, the kind a crisis manager uses before spinning a disaster. "I am just so incredibly sorry. I never, ever wanted you to find out like this. I know this must be a terrible shock." The words were optimized, the tone perfectly modulated. If Eliza hadn't listened to the diagnostic recordings on the smart home prototype, she might have bought the performance. She might have believed the act and blamed herself, and never realized that this was the woman who was not only in a relationship with her husband, but was systematically planning to erase her from his professional narrative. "When did you decide to rebrand my research on digital empathy?" Eliza asked, her voice low and precise like a surgical laser. Serena's mask of compassion faltered, a brief moment of buffering. "What are you talking about?" "The new pitch deck, the one where my behavioral models are presented as your own instinctive methodology, followed by you two celebrating how my maternity leave was the perfect opportunity." The color vanished from Serena's face, then flooded back in a hot, defiant wave. The shift was instant, like a friendly user interface switching to raw, unprotected code. "Fine," Serena snapped, her voice now stripped of its manufactured empathy. What was left was brittle and sharp. "You want the truth? He was creatively suffocating with you. The work we're doing is on a scale you simply can't grasp. I'm sorry it's messy, but our partnership is building the future." "You committed intellectual property theft," Eliza stated. It wasn't an accusation, it was a bug report, delivered with the quiet certainty of a master coder identifying a fatal flaw in the system. "I deserved a co-founder, not a con artist." Marcus walked in just then. He'd been taking a call in the living room, heard the change in the atmosphere, and entered the studio. With the unearned ease of a man who believes he is the visionary behind every success in his orbit. "Let's not get overly emotional, Eliza," he said. Eliza, her full name, not Liza, not Babe. The formal, detached term you use for an underperforming asset you're about to divest. He moved to stand beside Serena, resting a hand on her lower back, a clear signal of their new merger. The venture capitalist and his star performer standing together in Eliza's creative space, telling Eliza not to get emotional about being betrayed and systematically written out of her own life's work. She watched them for a silent second, processing the data. The way they stood, the way Serena accepted his touch with a sense of entitlement, a gesture both proprietary and for show. They were Silicon Valley's new power couple, a perfect alignment of capital and narrative. And that was the part that made it so much worse. Not that this was happening, but that it had been going on long enough for them to have their own choreographed routines. Eliza left it all. She didn't pack the industry awards, the valuable first editions on design theory, the life Marcus had so carefully curated for her. She walked away from everything he had funded because none of it had ever felt like her own creation. She took only 3 things: her work tablet, the first sonogram of their baby, and the worn leather case containing her father's first handcrafted guitar. The brushed steel door of the service elevator opened with a quiet hiss. The building's longtime concierge, a kind man named Jorge who always saved her the morning edition of the Chronicle, gave her a look of profound, unspoken support. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft, "you were the soul inside all his shiny machines. You deserve to build something of your own." She offered a small, fragile smile. "I know, Jorge. It's time to compose my own score." The heavy doors slid shut. The penthouse, their sterile glass box overlooking the bay, disappeared. Every floor she went down felt like peeling back another layer of a life that was now just a fabrication. By the time she was on the Bay Bridge, she was no longer Eliza Vance, wife of a tech mogul. She was Eliza Rossi, her father's daughter, and she was done letting someone else design her life. She was stopped in traffic for what felt like a lifetime. The tears refused to fall. She just sat there, one hand spread protectively over her stomach. The worn stitching of the steering wheel was a familiar anchor. The baby moved, a tiny, determined kick that felt like a promise. Through the windshield, she watched the San Francisco skyline pierce the evening fog, a city built on disruption and relentless ambition. Everyone was in motion, everyone launching something new. She did what she had always done when a user experience felt fundamentally broken. She went back to the workshop. She put the car in drive, merging with the flow of red taillights, and drove not to some anonymous temporary hotel, but to a quiet street in Berkeley. She pulled up to a detached garage behind a small bungalow, a place that smelled of cedar, varnish, and untapped potential. Her father's old workshop. She had kept the space after he died, a quiet refuge for her own projects, a place that was hers and hers alone. The workshop was simple and honest. The air was cool and silent. For a brief moment, she could almost hear her father. That Henry was in the studio, humming an old folk tune, carefully planning a piece of maple with a cast iron tool he'd had since before Eliza was born. But the workshop was still, and the silence was its own confirmation. She stepped inside, letting the heavy door swing shut behind her, and set her tablet down on a stack of lumber. Her father's familiar flannel jacket was still on a hook, a faint scent of wood shavings and rosin clinging to the collar. His enormous workbench stood like an altar near the window, a masterpiece of maple and ironwood, not sleek, not innovative, but it was where instruments with a soul were born. Henry used to say that instruments were like people. The best ones weren't always the most ornate. They were the ones with true resonance, the ones built to endure years of playing. A set of hand-drawn schematics for a cello was still held by a heavy brass paperweight on the workbench, studies in acoustic integrity that were his final obsession. He used to draw every evening after dinner, and the sharp, sweet smell of sawdust and shellac would fill their small apartment like a prayer. Eliza would drift off to sleep to the sound of his pencil sketching on paper, certain the world's most beautiful harmonies were being born from his hands. Henry's wire-rimmed glasses rested on a stack of drawings beside a forgotten mug of cold coffee. Sunday's paper was still on a stool. He had passed on a Monday. Eliza moved through the workshop, her fingers brushing over every surface, the shelves overflowing with worn books on woodworking and music theory, the window where her father had taped up templates with handwritten notes on wood grain. She opened the deep, flat drawers of a tool cabinet, not looking for anything specific, just reconnecting with the artifacts of his craft, the tangible evidence of a life spent creating things that last. In the very bottom drawer, she found what she hadn't even known she was looking for, a heavy, locked cherry wood toolbox. It was handmade, the brass hardware polished from a lifetime of care. She didn't need a key. She knew the 3-number combination by heart. Inside were not tools, but a single, leather-bound notebook of his designs. The kind of work you don't scan, the kind you protect. A faded photograph was tucked inside, showing a young man with a proud grin, holding the first guitar he ever sold in front of the small garage that would become his legend. Her father, barely 25, his eyes shining with a creative fire Eliza recognized in herself. He was celebrating the instrument that would define his craft, the beginning of his legacy. Tucked into the back of the notebook was a single sealed envelope addressed to her. It was a letter penned in her father's elegant script. It was dated from 4 years ago, right after she and Marcus got engaged. It read, "He has a perfect pitch, but no soul. Be careful." He went on to describe seeing Marcus with Serena at an industry dinner. "That one has the ambition of a shark." She was watching him not with admiration, but with calculation. He had seen it all from the beginning. Her signature was on the incorporation papers for Marcus's first fund, and she remembered her father's words that day. "Proof that my girl not only hears the music in the world, but has the hands to create it." She was not the discarded wife. She was her father's heir. The woman who taught her that a garden's soul was in its roots had once cataloged rare orchids in the Amazon. The woman who wore the same patched gardening clogs for 15 years had her botany medals stored in a shed. The woman who knew every groundskeeper by name had refused to sell her land to developers she despised. Ela sank onto the cool stone floor of the greenhouse and hugged a crate of her grandmother's old botanical sketches to her belly. There was no wild sobbing. She was far past that in the silent, hollow space where betrayal freezes the heart and the mind is too fractured to feel. The afternoon sun filtered through the glass panes, casting dappled, leafy shadows on the flagstones. The greenhouse was always chilly. Her grandmother believed plants, like people, needed a little hardship to grow strong. The air was a crisp 58 degrees. Isla pulled on a thermostat, but the old propane heater only sputtered in response, a metallic sigh that offered no comfort. She wrapped herself in layers she found in a nearby trunk, her grandmother's old wool cardigan, a thick burlap sack, the soft plaid blanket her grandmother's first ever research mentee had sent her one winter. The baby was restless, a flurry of kicks and turns against her ribs as if sensing her distress. Around 3 a.m, the cramping started. It was sharp and insistent, a deep, radiating ache. She lay on her grandmother's faded floral sofa, pulling her knees to her chest, her hands protectively cupping her stomach. She tried to remember what the doula had said about practice contractions, how the body just runs drills for the main event. Nothing to worry about, not at 7 months, not usually, but standing alone in the cold design studio, knowing the man she should be calling was the source of her agony. Asterisk, not usually asterisk, felt like a guarantee. And that guarantee felt like the foundation was crumbling right under her feet. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. No husband, no grandfather, no one. Just a drafty room filled with another woman's dream house and a baby trying to break into a broken world 2 months ahead of schedule. And there wasn't a single person on the planet who knew she was here. She dialed the only number that came to mind, Dr. Miller's after-hours line, her OB-GYN, the woman who had patiently answered every frantic question and explained every blurry ultrasound. "Dr. Miller's service," a calm voice answered. "It's Eleanor Vance. I think I'm having contractions. I'm only 7 months along, and I'm all by myself." "Okay, Eleanor, just focus on my voice. I need you to take a nice, slow breath in through your nose and then let it all the way out. Count to 5 for me as you breathe in and again as you breathe out. Can you do that for me?" She did as she was told. In, 2, 3, 4, 5. Out, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sharp, clenching pressure in her belly started to ease, the painful knot slowly unspooling. "Perfect," Dr. Miller said, her voice an anchor. "You're doing great. This is almost certainly from the stress you've been under. Your baby is fine, and you are fine, but I want you to come see me first thing this morning, just so we can be positive. Can you do that?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you." She hung up and collapsed onto the worn leather sofa, staring at the ceiling. A faint stress fracture she'd never noticed before snaked out from the corner of the room. In all the years she'd spent in this studio with her grandfather, she had never seen the cracks right above her head. "Everyone leaves. My father left. My husband built our entire marriage on a lie. My grandfather left me in silence. What was left? A baby who was about to be born into a structure that was compromised from the very beginning. At 3:21 in the morning, she unlocked her phone. She typed *, can a marriage survive an architect's affair, * into the search bar. Deleted it. Typed * division of inherited property infidelity, Massachusetts *. Deleted it. Typed *. I know my husband has been building a new life for years *. She stared at the glowing confession. Deleted that too. She flipped the phone over, pulled the heavy wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, and waited for the dawn. Morning came, as it always does. A knock on the studio door, sharp and certain, startled her from a shallow sleep. It was the kind of knock that meant business. Eleanor dragged the heavy studio door open to find her brother standing there. Early 30s with watchful eyes and an air of quiet intensity. He held a paper bag that smelled like fresh coffee and a large thermos. He wore a worn leather jacket and boots that had seen better days. This was Liam, her older brother, a private investigator who navigated the city's darkest corners and was never surprised by anything. Mom would kill me if I let you hide out in this dusty old studio alone, Liam said, his voice quiet and sure. He walked past Eleanor into the main room, placing the bag and thermos on a wide drafting table. He unscrewed the cap and poured steaming coffee into 2 mugs, his movements economical and precise. He found a box of donuts and a carton of milk and set them out. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer flimsy reassurances, didn't say, "I was so sorry to hear about Marcus," or "the developers have been calling." He just brought breakfast, pushed open the blackout shades to let in the weak Boston light, and carved out a small space of order in the chaotic, silent studio. When the coffee was poured, he slid a mug in front of Eleanor and sat across from her. He took a long drink, his eyes never leaving her face. "I know about the project," Liam said evenly. "I know about Marcus and that landscape designer. And I know you feel like you're about to shatter into a million pieces, but you won't. But for now, you don't have to be strong. For now, you just have to drink this coffee." Eleanor drank the coffee. It was the first thing she'd been able to keep down in days. It tasted of dark roast and cream and a small, unexpected bit of resolve. Liam laid out the situation the way he would a surveillance report. Just the facts, no emotion. They sat at her grandfather's old drafting table, and Liam spread out the last few months of his brother-in-law's betrayal like a series of incriminating photographs. "I knew something was off," Liam started. "I saw them." He took her to that architectural symposium in Vermont, the designer, Isabel. My agency was handling security. His excuse was research, but I saw the way he touched her arm, the way his hand rested on the small of her back when he thought they were alone. So I started a file, called it The Beacon Hill Betrayal, a private audit of his new life. Eleanor listened, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, the baby inside her suddenly quiet. "I pulled his financial statements, not as your brother, but as an investigator. The bank transfers you found? He was siphoning money from your inheritance to buy a new future. He was trying to figure it out, Elle. How to tell his pregnant wife their whole life was a lie without losing the money she brought into the marriage. The architectural plans were his confession, but they were also his escape plan, a way to build his new world before telling you the old one was being demolished. The story about a solo site visit was a lie," Liam confirmed, "but the timing was savagely cruel. He's a piece of work, your husband, so arrogant. Marcus wanted me to run a background check on Isabel, said she was a new partner, a fusion of design philosophies. I turned him down. I told him right there in his sleek minimalist office that I don't work for frauds. He iced me out after that, called me a paranoid, overprotective brother. He stopped showing up for Sunday dinner, stopped answering my texts, Grandpa raised us to see the flaws in a blueprint, no matter how pretty the drawing. And the plans. Here's the thing about Marcus, Liam said, leaning forward. He's a visionary, but he's sloppy. He knew those financial records were the only leverage you'd have. He never dreamed you'd find them. My last step was to give you the proof, so you could build your own life, a solid one. Dad left, and you built a career. You have the steel for this, too. So he hid it all in a project file, Eleanor whispered, the details locking together. She had seen the name, a single nauseating title, Our Sanctuary. He was designing everything, the secret trips to Vermont, the dinners, the house by the lake, every single lie rendered in perfect detail. None of the design magazines that praised his genius, none of the wealthy clients who lauded his vision, knew that his true masterpiece was a blueprint for betrayal, saved on a hidden drive. Liam nodded, his face a mix of fury and compassion. He was the wunderkind of Boston's design scene, he said, and the most gifted liar I've ever met. The sound of a key in the heavy studio lock cut through the silence. Marcus's voice called from the doorway. Ellie, you here? My phone died on the plane. Liam gave Eleanor a look, a silent promise that he wasn't going anywhere. Eleanor stood, walked to the edge of the main room, and waited. He appeared, his dark hair perfectly windswept, his designer trench coat slung over his arm. He was holding a small, elegant bouquet of peonies. He stopped dead when he saw Liam, his charming smile tightening at the edges. Then his eyes fell on the laptop. The project was open. The architectural renderings for the new house were displayed on the giant monitor in a stunning, heartbreaking presentation. Images of a romantic, glass-walled home nestled by a lake. Photos of Marcus and Isabel, smiling, integrated into the design mock-ups. Their initials carved into the digital model of a fireplace mantle. A screenshot of a text about the garden they would plant together. There were dozens of files, a complete visual record of their affair, documented with the cold, artistic precision of his own design portfolio. His face went white, the color draining from it until he looked like a marble statue. He stared from the screen to Eleanor, his mouth hanging open, unable to speak. Eleanor looked at the man she thought she was building a life with, at the lies presented in perfect, photorealistic detail, and felt not a crushing wave of sadness, but a sudden, unshakable calm. The baby kicked, a firm, solid thump. This was her real inheritance, not a messy public divorce, not a settlement, but something much stronger, the truth. And the original bank statements that proved his entire design empire was built with her family's money, a foundation she was now preparing to bulldoze. The truth was revealed with the click of a mouse. Eleanor Vance, 8 months pregnant and archiving her late grandfather's files, was cleaning up her husband Marcus Thorne's server in their Boston loft. A password-protected project titled Sanctuary snagged her attention. It wasn't the $200,000 budget for materials that made her gasp. It was the photorealistic renderings hidden inside the architectural plans, images of a dream home for two designed during a solo work retreat. Her brother Liam looked up from his notes and saw the color vanish from Eleanor's face. He knew right then this wasn't about design. This was about demolition. What Anya did in that moment was something Marcus's narcissistic, controlling ego could never have anticipated. She didn't throw her laptop. She didn't start screaming. She didn't even send him a furious text. Instead, she picked up her phone and called the one person she trusted implicitly with their finances, their firm's senior accountant. "Hi, Frank, it's Anya Thorne," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Quick question for you about company policy. To authorize material purchases over $50,000 for an external project, does that need approval from both founding partners, or can one partner sign off alone?" A pause, the gentle tapping of keys. "That requires a dual signature authorization form, Anya," Frank replied. his tone shifting from professional to worried. "It's a strict protocol to prevent unauthorized capital expenditure." The smug confidence in his voice was gone, replaced by the thin, cracking sound of sheer terror. Anya disconnected the call, a grim smile finding its way to her lips for the first time in months. She didn't need a shouting match. She had the expense reports, showing he'd been illegally diverting their company's funds. But she wanted Marcus to feel that dizzying drop in his stomach, just for a second. She wanted him to feel the dread of his meticulously designed world imploding, to see the architectural empire he worshipped revealed to be built on a fraudulent foundation. She walked to the window of their high-rise apartment. The lights of the San Francisco Bay glittered below. She focused on the steady, rhythmic beam of the Alcatraz lighthouse until it was sharp and clear. It took exactly 1 week to architect his ruin. Anya's most powerful tool was her composure. No tearful late-night calls, no vague and alarming posts on social media, no scathing emails. She let the legal process do its job, letting her new lawyers meticulously construct the case. The truth, she knew, always finds its way out, first as an industry whisper, then as a damning exposé. She engaged the most feared forensic accounting team in the Bay Area and filed a lawsuit alleging financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and the embezzlement of company funds to finance a personal side project. She demanded her 50%. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the sheer arrogance. It was him using their shared company account to pay the deposit on a modernist cliffside property in Carmel for her. That felt like the final, devastating insult. The transaction notification from their bank's app flashed on her phone on a Thursday morning. Anya called his mobile at 10:15. The voice that answered wasn't the deep, commanding tone of San Francisco's most promising young architect, but the reedy, faltering voice of a man caught in a web of his own making. The performance was over, only panic remained. "What's this about, Anya?" he stammered. "Are you auditing my project expenses now?" She gripped the phone, standing in the middle of the nursery they had just finished painting a soft, hopeful shade of coastal blue. The smell of low VOC paint still hung in the air. The preliminary sketches for their own dream home lay on her desk, a relic of a future that was now just a mirage. "I had my own career before you, Marcus," she whispered to the quiet apartment. "You just built your reputation so tall I forgot I had my own skyline." She ended the call. No tears fell. Instead, a cold, structural clarity settled into her soul. Chloe, his ambitious new junior architect, had posted a picture to her private Instagram feed just last night. It was a selfie of her and Marcus, toasting with champagne on a bluff overlooking the ocean, the sunset behind them. Chloe wasn't just the new protege Marcus was mentoring. She was the new life he was building, and Anya was just the foundation he was ready to bulldoze. "Anya," Frank began, his voice on the phone thick with hesitation, "I feel you have a right to know. I'm seeing some very alarming irregularities in the books. Marcus is funneling significant funds into an LLC under the name Seacliff Designs, writing them off as consulting fees. He secured a construction loan against the firm's assets for a property in Monterey County. It wasn't for a client. He's leveraging our reputation to build something personal, and it's putting the entire firm's solvency at risk." "Thank you for telling me, Frank," she replied, her own voice almost unnervingly composed. "I appreciate your integrity." "The man I helped build this firm with is gone," Frank admitted. "Or maybe he was never really here at all." She forwarded Frank's email with the attached files to her legal team. It was another spreadsheet, another falsified invoice, another steel beam in the case she was constructing against Marcus Thorne. The unavoidable confrontation took place on a Monday morning in their firm's glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor overlooking the Bay Bridge. It was their space, where they'd landed their first big client, where they celebrated every successful bid. The head of the massive redwood table was where he had once sketched out their 5-year plan on a notepad. He chose the venue intentionally, a pathetic attempt to stage manage the end. And he brought Chloe. That was his next calculated move. Chloe wore a stark, geometric silver necklace, a piece Anya recognized from Marcus's early designs, wearing it like a trophy from a contest Anya hadn't even entered. But Anya showed up as someone new. She was centered, having spent the past week at her parents' vineyard in Sonoma. Her father's quiet strength, her mother's rose garden, the familiar peace of the valley, it had all reinforced her own sense of self. She wore a simple black dress and the small gold pendant her mother had given her when she graduated from design school. No gifts from Marcus, no designer labels, no pretense, just Anya. She asked for a water and waited. Marcus naturally took the lead. He had to be the lead architect of every situation. "Let's keep this civil," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Sign the dissolution papers. You keep the apartment. I'll give you a stipend of $30,000 a month. Don't make this difficult." "I have a different set of blueprints," Anya responded, her tone as placid as the bay below. It was a voice she hadn't used in years, but one her father would have instantly recognized. "You sign over my 40% equity in Thorne and Associates, and I won't submit these records of your embezzlement to the American Institute of Architects Ethics Committee." The blood drained from Marcus's face. He didn't flush with anger. He turned a horrifying chalky white. It was the look of a developer who just found a fatal crack in his foundation. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "Frank wouldn't." "She's bluffing," Chloe interjected, her voice an octave too high. Anya finally turned her head and looked at Chloe. Really saw her for the first time since the ordeal began. She saw the woman who had fallen for her husband's ambition and felt nothing. Not jealousy, not rage, just an empty, hollowed-out space. "I'm not," Anya continued, "and Frank didn't have to." Marcus's carefully constructed composure shattered. His hand slammed down on the redwood table, rattling the water glasses. The quiet productivity of the office ceased as every employee turned to stare into the glass conference room. A senior partner started to get up from his desk. Marcus shot him a look of such raw fury that the man sank back into his chair. Chloe grabbed his arm, her face a canvas of alarm, not for Anya, but for him, for the man she had attached her future to. The volatile, trapped man who slammed tables and treated his partners like subordinates. Chloe was getting a sneak preview of her prize. This was absolutely not the future she had envisioned for them. The server placed the bill on the white tablecloth. Ilara put her black credit card on the tray without looking. Her hand was perfectly steady. She rose, gave them both a cool, almost imperceptible nod, and walked through the restaurant's grand oak doors for the last time. The consequences were immediate. Leo hired a shark from a major downtown law firm, a woman known for leaving her opponents with nothing. Leo's mother, Catherine Vance, called Ilara that night. The conversation lasted less than a minute. "You will not destroy my son's reputation," Catherine said, her voice as crisp as a cold winter morning. Every word was a carefully aimed dart. "We will ruin you." "Catherine," Ilara replied, her tone even, "your son ruined himself. I'm just cleaning up the mess." She ended the call. Catherine called back 2 more times. Ilara let them go to voicemail. The next week, she drove to see her great-uncle, Simon. He was the one who had stayed behind when her father left the family's rigid, old-money manufacturing empire. He was the patriarch her father had defied, a man who commanded a sprawling estate on the North Shore that felt more like a corporate campus than a home. But the man who greeted her was not the fearsome titan from family stories. At 75, he was frail and thin, with the weary look of someone who had spent too much time alone with his regrets. His eyes, however, were still sharp and clear, and in them Ilara saw an emotion she knew all too well: loss. He looked at her and his polished facade cracked. "You have your father's eyes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My God, you have his spirit." He led her inside, showing her the vast library with its leather-bound books where her father had plotted his different life, the garage where they had rebuilt a vintage motorcycle together. He told her stories about her father as a young man, passionate, brilliant, arguing with his own father at the dinner table about the morality of a hostile takeover. "I should have left with him," Simon said, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have had his courage. But I was a coward. By the time I realized my mistake, my whole life had gone by." He offered Elara his entire arsenal of resources, his legal team, his forensic accountants, the powerful network of contacts he had built over 50 years. Amelia agreed, but with one stipulation that was non-negotiable. "No press," she said, her voice steady. "No public war. My only goal is to shield my child's future and build something that is entirely my own." Marcus's father nodded, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine peace seemed to smooth the weary creases around his eyes. "You have more of your grandfather's steel than you know," he said. That evening, in her mother's warm, inviting kitchen, Amelia helped prepare her father's favorite slow-braised short ribs. They avoided any mention of lawyers or hedge funds. They talked about him instead. Her mother shared anecdotes Amelia had never heard. Her father, at 17, sneaking into jazz clubs in the village to play his saxophone. Her father, at 21, telling his own powerful father that a man's character was his only true portfolio, not his inheritance. Her father, choosing a life of passion over a life of privilege, choosing a meaningful existence over a gilded cage, choosing to raise a daughter who understood her own intrinsic value from day one. The kitchen filled with the savory aroma of cooking, thick with memories and soft laughter. And in those moments, her father's quiet strength felt like a tangible, comforting presence in the room. Julian's firm didn't implode because of Amelia. It consumed itself. His star quantitative analyst, David Chen, resigned, citing an irreconcilable difference in ethical principles in a terse email to the primary investors. The financial journalists never saw the email, but the sovereign wealth funds did. Without David's algorithms, the fund's performance faltered. A major acquisition deal in London fell apart, wiping out $700 million in projected capital. A vital partnership with a Tokyo-based bank was terminated. Once rumors of the separation and whispers of financial instability started making the rounds, two of their biggest backers, pension funds that prize stability above all else, silently pulled their money. Catherine Vance's exclusive social circle began to hum with speculation. Business was one thing, and affairs were hardly uncommon. But defrauding your pregnant wife, the respected architectural historian whose family name gave his career its sterling credibility, that crossed an unspoken boundary among Manhattan's elite. The invitations for charity galas and exclusive Hamptons weekends simply dried up. With only Sarah on his arm, Julian was quietly blacklisted from the world he desperately wanted to conquer. Meanwhile, Sarah was drawing her own conclusions. She had moved into the Park Avenue penthouse, the one Amelia had painstakingly curated with museum-quality art and bespoke furniture. Sarah slept in the bed Amelia had chosen, cooked in the kitchen Amelia had designed, and used the bathrobes Amelia had left behind. But the penthouse felt less like a victory and more like a cold, empty museum. The view of Central Park was stunning, but the apartment itself was sterile, hollow. It wasn't a matter of temperature, it was the atmosphere. The silence was immense. The voids in their conversations grew wider. Julian would return late, his gaze locked on the glowing screen of his phone throughout their silent dinners. He spoke to Sarah with that same polished, practiced charm he had once deployed on Amelia, the smooth delivery of a man reciting lines from a script he no longer believed in. He began to probe her professional contacts, casually asking who she was meeting for drinks, Not from genuine interest, but from a need to monitor and control every asset, just as he managed his financial portfolios. He started offering small, cutting critiques of her analysis. That market projection feels a bit unsophisticated, don't you think? At first, his manipulations were subtle. You have to project unwavering certainty, Chloe. In our world, perception is everything. But after any small argument, Marcus would go silent, icing her out for days, revoking her access to shared drives, and excluding her from key meetings. It was a form of digital banishment, the exact strategy Audrey had endured for the final 2 years of their marriage. It is a specific kind of psychological warfare engineered to make you doubt your own competence, to make you obsess over your perceived flaws until you've worn yourself down into the flawless, compliant accessory he requires. Chloe finally cracked on a Tuesday night, her voice a raw, shaky whisper on the encrypted call. "He's not who I thought he was." Audrey was in her family's brownstone in Boston. Her newborn son slept upstairs, and the old house was still, save for the low hum of the city. Her friend had just oiled a squeaky hinge on the library door. A cup of chamomile tea sent fragrant steam into the cool evening air. Outside, the Boston skyline was a tapestry of deep indigo and distant lights. She just listened. She offered no "I told you so," no simple reassurances. She just held the space, the way one listens to a weather alert for a hurricane that has already passed. "I know," Audrey said finally. "I was married to him once." She ended the call, drank the last of her tea, and slept soundly until morning. The arbitration was set for 3 weeks later. Audrey's legal team presented its case with chilling precision. The predatory terms of the co-founder agreement, the blatant infidelity, the documented campaign of emotional abuse during her pregnancy, and the financial malfeasance her forensic accountant had meticulously uncovered. Offshore crypto wallets, anonymous shell corporations, and company funds systematically funneled to support a lifestyle of staggering excess. The arbitrator listened, her face growing more severe with every slide of the presentation. Silicon Valley did not look kindly on this kind of brazen, old-world fraud. Marcus's legal team blustered, lodging objections and citing obscure bylaws, but the blockchain data was absolute. Without a legal buyout, Audrey was entitled to her founder's equity, 50% of a $2 billion technology empire. But then Audrey did something that left the entire room speechless. Not Marcus, not his lawyers, and not even her own lead attorney David initially. She didn't touch her share of the company. She claimed only what was owed to her child, a completely funded, ironclad trust for a full STEM education through his doctorate, comprehensive lifetime health coverage, and a legally binding condition that Marcus would have no parental rights until he completed a full year of court-ordered therapy and could prove verifiable, sustained behavioral improvement. That was all. She left the stock, the Atherton mansion, the Gulfstream jet, and the modern art collection on the table. Her lawyer was aghast. "You are walking away from $1 billion, he whispered, stunned. David, however, allowed himself a slight, knowing smile. "She isn't trying to bankrupt him," he explained to his junior associate later. "She's making him irrelevant." "I don't need his company to have value," Audrey told a close friend later that day. "I've always known my value. My grandfather made sure of it." The true story emerged 2 weeks later, not through a leak or a court document. It broke because actions have consequences, and Audrey's action triggered a seismic shift. The Harrison Foundation. It unveiled its newest major initiative, funding the complete archival digitization for 50 underfunded public libraries, establishing a new grant for emerging digital artists at MIT, and endowing a women's health technology incubator in downtown Boston, all financed by a single anonymous donor, Audrey Harrison. A sharp journalist at The Atlantic connected the dots. The feature story went viral. The Quiet Curator, Boston's Audrey Harrison, revealed as Harrison Industrial Heiress. The tech and finance worlds were captivated. The narrative was irresistible. The arrogant, new money tech founder and the brilliant, understated scholar he betrayed while she was pregnant with his son. An unseen, old-world fortune that made his tech billions seem like pocket change. It was the kind of story that fascinated everyone. The quiet woman he had written off was, in fact, royalty in a world he could never hope to enter. Marcus read the article alone in his office of glass and steel. His lead engineer was gone. The investors were calling with serious concerns. Chloe had just accepted a director-level position at a rival company. He sat at his vast, empty desk, staring at Audrey's calm, poised face on his monitor as his own turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. The color of a man who has just realized the woman he called insignificant was worth 10 times more than anything he had ever built. He tried to phone Audrey. Her number had been changed. He called David Chen, her lawyer. An email alert appeared on her screen. It was from Marcus's main server. The subject line was stark. Formal notice of termination. Your system access has been revoked, the automated text read. Effective immediately. Chloe saw the internal memo too. She was in a sterile hotel room in Zurich, her hand wrapped around a coffee cup that was now ice cold. She stared at the rain-streaked windows and felt a deep, chilling dread settle in her stomach. She had hitched her entire career to a shooting star, only to be jettisoned like a security threat. The exclusive prototype smartwatch on her wrist, a gift from Marcus, now felt like a cold digital handcuff. As a final petty insult, a junior HR rep had even misspelled her name on the exit forms. Audrey wasn't correcting anyone's spelling. She was far too busy attempting to assemble a bassinet, a new one for a new room, signaling a new life. Her son was born on a Tuesday morning in May. Audrey awoke at 5:22 a.m. to a pressure that was entirely new. This was nothing like the anxious fluttering she had felt in the cold, minimalist house she had shared with Marcus. This was primal, absolute, and profound, the kind of force that doesn't ask for permission and simply takes over. She texted her doula, then she called her mother. Then, in the quiet light of the pre-dawn city, she picked up the hospital bag that had been waiting by the door for the last 2 weeks. And she drove herself to the coast. Because she was Isla Sloane, and Isla Sloane did not wait for someone else to rescue her. Her aunt found her there a day later, a flurry of concern, her silver hair breaking free from its neat bun, wearing hiking boots with a silk blouse hastily thrown over her yoga clothes. I think I broke the speed limit in 3 counties, she said. Your grandmother would be so incredibly proud. The drive had taken 10 hours. Isla hadn't cried. She had breathed, she had focused, and she gripped the steering wheel with a force that left her knuckles white. The steady rhythm of the highway was a meditation, a constant hum that guided her through each wave of panic, like a lighthouse cutting through fog. At 3:37 in the afternoon, as she pulled up to the old family cottage, a new resolve arrived. A boy. It entered her thoughts with a roar, not a gentle notion, but a powerful, absolute certainty that declared to the world, I am his mother. This is our time now. Adjust accordingly. She parked the car and laid a hand on her belly, feeling the warm, solid weight of him, impossibly small, yet already so significant. Isla looked at the churning gray ocean, the endless horizon, and felt a profound internal shift. It wasn't emotional. It was elemental, as if her entire world had been instantly realigned to orbit this tiny, unborn person. Hello? She whispered to her stomach. Hello, Leo Sloane? Not Vaughn. Sloane, her family's name. A name that carried the legacy of science and resilience. Her aunt stood on the porch, tears streaming down her face in a beautiful, relieved mess. Oh, little Leo, you perfect thing. Your great-grandmother would be so thrilled right now, absolutely overcome with joy. Julian Vaughn was not anxiously calling her phone. He hadn't sent a worried text or an email pleading for her to come home. He was notified of her departure via a single cold text message from her new, untraceable number. The message was brief, brutal, and contained only the information a cheating husband deserved to receive. His reply came as a series of frantic calls and texts over the next 32 minutes, a waterfall of question marks and panicked apologies. Isla saw the notifications light up her screen, blocked his number, and placed the phone face down on the counter. She never responded. Her old professor from Cornell, a man who'd mentored her in landscape architecture, sent a beautiful hand-pressed flower in a frame the following week. "He is so lucky to have you. Welcome to the world, little Leo." Isla hung it in the room she was turning into a nursery. It would stay there for the next 18 years. 6 weeks passed in that strange, suspended way, an eternity and a heartbeat all at once. Every day was a quiet symphony of preparing, nesting, and early morning walks on a beach. Every day was a tiny miracle of feeling him move, of watching the ocean, and the deep, grounding peace of choosing your own path. Isla moved into the small saltbox cottage on the coast of Maine, a few miles from a quiet town. It wasn't a sleek condo or a glass-walled brownstone. It was a sanctuary. It had 2 bedrooms, a wild garden overlooking the sea, and a screened-in porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the lobster boats return to the harbor. Her grandmother's old sunroom was in the back, which she made into her studio. Isla had the large paned windows resealed and put her drafting table where the morning light poured in. A bassinet was set up on the worn pine floor beside it, covered with a handmade quilt, ready for Leo. She started working again as a freelance landscape architect. From her sun-drenched table, blueprints and seed catalogs were spread across the old wood, surrounded by soil samples, sketches of public park designs, and a perpetually lukewarm mug of herbal tea. She was designing a therapeutic garden for the local veterans home, mentoring a young horticulture student online, and planning a community vegetable garden, naming it after her grandmother, of course. Everything finally had purpose. She heard about Chloe from a former coworker in a text message one Tuesday afternoon in November. For a moment, she barely registered the name. Chloe had been abruptly transferred, the kind of sudden move that happens when a liability needs to be quietly removed. A notification on the new smart display, a shared calendar event she hadn't created, labeled Vermont Getaway. A work retreat, she assumed. She tapped it open. Hotel confirmations, spa bookings, and notes. Dozens of them, detailing plans for Chloe at a secluded inn, wearing a new dress, drinking champagne in their private hot tub. The screen's cold light illuminated Ila's face, her breath hitched in her chest. This wasn't just an affair, it was an invasion, a parallel life planned behind her back. She scrolled through the notes, a hot, metallic jealousy rising in her throat, so sharp it felt like a shard of glass. Julian's polished Boston biotech lab suddenly felt a world away, its quiet hum replaced by the frantic, suffocating beat of her own heart. She heard the key in the front door, not with a roar, not with tears, but with a terrifying stillness. Isla turned as Julian walked in. "I saw the calendar invite for your trip," she said, her voice like ice. A simple sentence that shattered the life they had pretended to have. He started to sputter, to lie, to explain, but she held up a hand. "I don't want to hear it, Julian. I want you to stay here and look at the life you just burned to the ground." She picked up her bag, walked to the door, and left him standing alone, surrounded by the automated, empty perfection he had designed but had just terminally corrupted. The personal fallout was swift. Whispers of his instability started circulating after Ila's father, a powerful figure in finance, made a few quiet phone calls. The pivotal third round of funding for his startup was put on indefinite hold pending a leadership review. Chloe was immediately offered a promotion at their firm's Zurich office and stopped answering Julian's calls, her careerism easily eclipsing their fling. his co-founders began holding strategy sessions without him. He holed up in his empty brownstone overlooking the Charles River, spending his days watching the rowers glide by and his nights with a bottle of very expensive scotch. The gleaming smart display on the kitchen island was off now, the screen he'd cracked in a fit of rage. After Isla had calmly read the incriminating notes aloud to him, Chloe was there in the booking confirmation, a small profile picture of her smiling at a company party. His hands balled into fists. It was a team-building event, he'd told Isla, just a mandatory weekend in the mountains. Now Isla was gone, disappeared after an hour of his pathetic denials, taking nothing but her laptop and the small antique wooden box that held her grandmother's journals. He stood on the cold marble floor, the same spot where they'd hosted a dinner for his investors, the same spot where the smart display had hit the floor during his outburst. The hairline fractures were gone. He'd had the whole unit replaced the next day. But Julian could feel the chasms cracking through his meticulously constructed world. The floor-to-ceiling windows of his Boston success had become a cage he had built for himself. Isla understood that now, curled up on her grandmother's old reading chair in the cozy Maine cottage with her laptop open, she could see it all. The trap hadn't been Julian himself. The trap was thinking that his world of venture capital and relentless ambition was the only one that mattered. Her own work, a portfolio of beautiful, life-affirming garden designs, had been gathering dust on a server. So she could finally see the worth in her own life. 2 months had passed. It was a crisp December morning. The Maine coastline was dusted with the first snow of winter. Her Aunt Chloe was back in California, leaving the cottage peaceful with the steady crackle of the fireplace. Isla was sketching a playground design for the town, a sense of focus she hadn't felt since before she'd met Julian. The scent of pine from the fire still clung to the air. The heavy ceramic mug, the only thing she'd taken from the Boston kitchen, warmed her hands. The scent of linseed oil and old books filled the Chicago loft. A welcome change from the sterile air of the high-rise she'd left behind. Isla sat curled on the plush velvet sofa. The intercom chirped, and a moment later, her sister's friend Catherine, a sharp, compassionate family lawyer, walked in, holding a tablet and 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Kat's eyes were kind but unflinching. She pulled up the file, the first formal step in dismantling her marriage to Julian. Booking your anniversary suite for his assistant? That's a special kind of cruel, Kat murmured, glancing at the evidence on the screen. He never was very good at covering his tracks, Isla replied, her voice raw. They signed the engagement letter on Grace's antique wood coffee table. It was positioned between a half-finished canvas and a scattered deck of tarot cards. A $10,000 retainer transferred from the savings account she'd started before him. The tap of the stylus on the glass screen was a quiet, definitive sound, the most terrifying and liberating moment of her life. After Kat left, Isla washed the mugs, placed them carefully on a drying rack, and opened her laptop. She began methodically updating her graphic design portfolio, her movements deliberate and focused. The fonts she chose were bold, unapologetic. The coffee was still warm. The oversized Northwestern University sweatshirt, a relic from her sister's college days, was a soft armor against her skin. It smelled like Grace, a scent that had always meant safety. On the long drive from the Loop, she'd stared blankly at the blur of city lights. Upon arriving, she'd slipped off her boots at the door, her hand instinctively going to her swollen belly, feeling the gentle kick of her daughter within. She breathed in the familiar loft air, paint, coffee, and urban rain. She settled into the worn armchair by the industrial window, tucking her feet beneath her. The baby moved again, a secret message just for her. Grace's lanky greyhound nudged a cold nose into her hand. Her sister's words from their frantic call that morning echoed in the quiet room, a promise forged in a lifetime of crises. When family needs you, you don't ask questions. You don't weigh the options. You just get in the car and drive. I'm here. End of story. The baby stirred once more as if she understood. Isla began to trace slow, soothing circles on her stomach, a silent oath to the new life she carried. It was her grandmother's vow, whispered during thunderstorms in their childhood bedroom in Evanston. The words she'd repeat whenever Isla felt small and lost, creating a fortress that no man's ego could ever breach and no betrayal could fully demolish. She closed her eyes, remembering her grandmother's voice. "Find where it hurts the most, my love, and send your breath right there. That's how you heal it from the inside." For the first time in months, she believed it. A profound sense of peace settled over the loft, muffling the distant rumble of the L train, weaving through the sound of a blues saxophone from a bar down the street, and sinking deep into a life that had been shattered. But in that wreckage, she felt the unyielding power of a mother's vow to her unborn daughter. The architecturally perfect nursery Julian had designed was a room she would never see again, a pristine monument to a lie. But a new life would be built from the salvaged, beautiful pieces of her own strength. Legacies of love always are. This narrative was crafted by our team to explore the intricate paths of modern heartbreak and the resilience discovered in its wake. Each character, choice, and emotional current was designed to resonate, to connect, and to affirm that your own story is a battle worth winning. We appreciate you sharing this journey with us.